But good morning everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today, but hopefully this recording works. I'm going to take you through the Garden Escapers project, which is a partnership between Coventry University and North West Wildlife Trust, kindly funded by Natural Resources Wales. Getting onto the project itself, as I introduce the project team, I'm working on this project with North West Wildlife Trust, but also as a research fellow at Coventry University. My research background is on engaging with gardeners to prevent invasive species, having recently submitted my PhD thesis. We also have Lisa Toth working on this project at North West Wildlife Trust, who's a garden designer by background. So she brings in a totally different perspective on the same issue. So let's look at invasive species before we get onto the project itself. Invasive species as a global issue. So here on this slide we have 5 direct drivers that have been identified by the IPBES global assessment. Those are 5 drivers of the nature crisis essentially. So we are familiar with these: changes in land use, habitat loss essentially, direct exploitation of organisms, for example overfishing, pollution is of course very topical at the moment, and climate change. And I normally make the point that invasive species, represented here with the grey squirrel, gets less attention than the other 4. And of course they all interact to a degree, and I'll get onto the interaction between invasive species and climate change later on in the talk. So a global issue, and there are global ambitions to tackle invasive species. For example, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed late last year. Target 6 of that specifically looks at invasive species and has an emphasis on their prevention. If I was with you this morning, we would do this as an interactive task. But the part of the project is to increase awareness of invasive species. So a definition is important here. I would normally ask during a talk for answers to this simple question: how do you define an invasive plant? But here I will use this simple word cloud just to illustrate the exercise. So these are responses from the Average Chelsea Flower Show back in 2019 for the same question. And each time I ask this during a talk or an event, some of the main concepts keep coming up. So in the word cloud, we have a distinction between a native species and a non-native species, which I'll touch on later on. The fact that invasive species spread, they can be difficult to control. And then along the trunk, if you will, is unwanted, which brings in the subjectivity. Now, as a research scientist, of course, I try to look at the issue as objectively as possible, but there is undoubtedly judgment and emotion, especially when we're looking at invasive species control and management. But for the purpose of the talk, we need an agreed definition to work to. So that's going to be invasive species as non-native species that have been introduced by humans from all over the world. Critically, they now threaten biodiversity, the economy, or human health. That's the definition I'm using for the talk. There isn't agreement on what an invasive species is, I don't think. Neither is there agreement on the distinction between a native and a non-native species, but that's a talk in itself. So let's work with this definition for now. Research suggests that gardeners might not be aware of the threat posed by invasive species escaping their gardens. That's despite gardeners having such a crucial role to play here. So with that definition in mind, let's look at our gardens very quickly and how invasive species escape beyond into the wild. I start this section by emphasizing the positives. Now, gardeners, of course, have many benefits, including through wildlife gardening, such as supporting biodiversity and ecosystem services, improving human health, now that can be physical and mental health, and mitigating the impact of climate change. Now, despite those positives, there is a but, which is where the project comes in, essentially. Invasive species, the main source of invasive species globally are gardens. You can frame it differently. You can say that the main pathway of introduction for invasive species globally is ornamental horticulture. Now, can think of the invasion process as a bit of a story. I'm not going to get into too much detail on the terminology on this slide, but if you think about gardens as the first chapter, we've been introducing plants into gardens for centuries. Now, some of those will escape into the wild. They won't necessarily survive, but you might find them in the wild as your next chapter. Of those that do escape, some survive on their own and reproduce naturally. Those are what we term naturalized species. The example given here is Alchemilla mollis lady's mantle. Some of those might prove invasive, but you can think of it as a story. But here, perspective is very, very important. In the blue circle on the left, we have the native flora for Britain and Ireland. In the grey circle, we have our ornamental flora, essentially. So the RHS plant finder is often used as a proxy for the number of different ornamental plants we have in Britain and Ireland, or in this case, the United Kingdom. The most recent edition of the RHS plant finder includes around 70,000 entries. Now that includes native ornamentals. It also includes the varieties and the different cultivars. So what I've done here is to look at the species within that plant finder, which is around 17,000, because 70,000 wouldn't fit on the slide. The exact number doesn't matter, we're just looking at the relative size of the categories. Now those in the grey circle are confined to gardens at the moment, so essentially the first chapter within the invasion process. The pink circle represents the escapees, so those ornamentals that have escaped gardens and grow in the wild. You can see that relatively it is very, very similar in number to the native flora. So if we go back to earlier this year, the BSBI launched their fantastic plant atlas, and one of the headline figures for that was that there was more non-native taxa within the British and Irish flora compared to native taxa. So that pink circle is very marginally bigger, but we're focusing on ornamentals. The important point in terms of perspective here is that the red circle is very small. So despite the fact that gardens are the main source of invasive species globally, it is a relatively small number of those ornamentals that have proved invasive in having an impact on biodiversity, the economy, or human health. So that perspective is important. Let's look very quickly at some examples of invasive species before I get onto the project. So the most notorious example might be Japanese knotweed. We will have all heard about Japanese knotweed. I'm not going to go through the facts for each species here, but I give you the native range, and the interesting part might be the difference between the date of introduction and first record in the wild. This varies from a few years to a few decades, maybe centuries. We often call it the time lag, and that's very stochastic. I also give you the dispersal mechanism and its status, in which, in this case, it is a widely regarded invasive species. So that's one example. Second example, different to Japanese knotweed, because here cherry laurel is still actively sold in garden centres. It is sold often as a choice for hedging because it is evergreen. That is also one of the reasons why it can be very invasive in woodlands. If the seeds disperse into nearby woodlands from gardens, because it is evergreen, it forms very dense shade, essentially pushing out the ground flora within that woodland. So that's one specific impact on biodiversity. And the third, the most difficult one maybe to communicate as an invasive species is that of butterfly bush. Difficult because it is a good example of why the issue of invasive species is not black and white. There are pros and cons to each species. As the common name suggests, it is often seen with butterflies on it. So it is not always an easy environmental issue to be communicating because there are many nuances involved. But it produces so much seed. It can be very invasive in becoming dominant within certain habitats, especially urban, semi-urban habitats and those disturbed habitats. But I'm not going to go into too much detail about the specific impacts of these invasive species because I want to get onto the project. Gardens project, I've given you the context to it, that of invasive species, and I will emphasize this point that gardeners are essentially on the front line because they can observe ornamental plants showing invasive potential, invasive behavior, if you will. And this is very important because they can identify invasive potential early in the invasion process. And I mentioned the importance of prevention in terms of reaching global ambitions earlier on with the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. And this project is looking at how we can essentially capture this data. So in terms of project outcomes, we're looking at increased awareness of invasive species or invasive ornamentals and how gardeners can help by being bee plant wise, promoting a platform called Plant Alert, which I'll get to in a second. Through the project, explore which ornamentals have already escaped the risk species, and then have a regionally specific list of alternative plants, and I'll touch on this guide later on. So those are the project outcomes. We've been focusing on Northwest Wales, looking at which ornamentals are spreading in gardens, also looking at which ones are found outside gardens, such as in neighbouring protected sites, although we haven't been able to do that as much as I would have liked. In terms of increasing awareness, we delivered 6 events in the target locations, which are shown on the map, and we'll have one stakeholder workshop in January of next year to bring some of the results together. So one part of the project which has been different and novel is doing garden visits. So prior to a garden visit, we've done an online survey of awareness, which I won't focus on today because of the time limit. During the garden visits, doing a garden inventory, which I'll explain in a second, and using Plant Alert. Inventories was looking at the size and style of garden, but then more importantly, spending about an hour, sometimes longer, compiling a full list of plants in the garden. And that element of the project was new. That helps us check which are found going beyond the gardens. And we have done 27 garden visits and 27 inventories so far in the project. During the garden visits, we've also been promoting this Plant Alert platform. So the critical point here is that gardeners can report ornamental plants showing invasive behavior. This Plant Alert is led by Coventry University and the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, the data going into the BSBI database. So far we've had around 500 surveys across GB, around 280 different species recorded, and 810 unique records sent through Plant Alert. Now those are across GB, but we have been promoting it here in North West Wales. So the results for Plant Alert at the moment across GB, the top 5, Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed and green alkanet. And those 3 are widely labelled as invasive already. But then we have Himalayan honeysuckle, which I'll get to later on, and heartleaf Cotinia. So those do not currently have the label of invasive, but they might be invasive in future. And that's the whole principle behind Plant Alert. It essentially gives us a short list of taxa to look at because we have too many growing in gardens. If we go back to the 70,000 figure in the RHS Plant Finder, that's too many for us to be looking at the risk. So it gives us this short list that we can work on. Before I get on to how to explore that data a bit further, the results for Plant Alert for North West Wales specifically, the most commonly reported taxa have been Verbena bonariensis, Japanese anemone, and Cotoneaster horizontalis, which the third one already having that invasive label. So in terms of exploring these future invaders or the invasive potential, if you will, there are different ways for us to do that. One of the key drivers here is climate change. So if we go back to the 5 drivers of the nature crisis earlier, I explained that they interact with each other. Climate change and invasive species definitely interact. These are the average global temperatures, the warming stripes, from the University of Reading, which is a strong graphic, I think, to summarize climate change. Why is climate change important? It gives ornamental plants a head start. We have been moving these plants to every corner of the world beyond their native range for centuries. They therefore have a climatic head start. Climate change also gives gardeners an opportunity to experiment with new plants. We only need to think about how common it is now to have a banana plant in the garden. Only go back 10 years and it would be very uncommon to have a banana plant growing in your herbaceous bed. Now, yes, they might need protection from the frost, but that's just one example of how it's allowing us, climate change, it's allowing us as gardeners to experiment with new plants. And lastly, climate change does facilitate the invasion process, that story of chapters that I went through very quickly earlier on. To explore this impact of climate change in a bit more detail, we can use one case study species, which is Houttenia caudata. This was first recorded in the wild in GB in 1992. It's a very common garden plant, rapidly spreading perennial, often grown on pond margins because it prefers damp ground. Its status in GB at the moment is naturalized, so it survives on its own in the wild and reproduces on its own, but with limited distribution. To look at what impact climate change might have on its potential to naturalize, we can use a method called species distribution modeling. So what I'm showing you on the slide here is by no means conclusive, but I wanted to use the maps to illustrate the example of this method to you. It's easier to explain in person, but I'll try through this recording. So what we essentially have is a gradient of suitability, climate suitability, going from the very light pinks, which is climatically unsuitable, to the greens, which are climatically suitable. Species distribution modeling essentially finds a relationship between current distribution, be that its distribution in GB or global distribution, finding a relationship between that and current climate. That is what you have on the left, where the green areas show which parts of GB and Ireland are most climatically suitable for Houttenia caudata currently. On the right, we can use climate projections going forward. Here we have 2070. By using that relationship and the climate projections, we can see how that pattern changes. If I can generalize climate projections to a very basic level, the southeast especially is expected to have much hotter, drier summers, with the northwest expected to get milder, wetter winters. That matches the preference for this plant or this species specifically. As I say, it's often grown along the side of ponds or streams because it prefers damp conditions. That is matched by the climate suitability map for 2070. As I say, it's not conclusive, but it's easier to explain how we can explore the shortlist of ornamentals that we get by using Plant Alert. It's easier to explain with this map to illustrate the benefits of species distribution modeling. We can also use different methods. We can focus on the traits of species, or even do mixed methods where you combine the species distribution modeling with the trait approach. And you can also complete a risk assessment. I've completed a risk assessment for the GB non-native species secretariat for Acacia equinata, chocolate vine, and black bamboo, Phytostrachus nigra, as two species that might be potentially invasive in future. So if I look at examples of potentially invasive species, some of these have come through the project, but also looking at the wider research field of Plant Alert and my PhD research. Example is Alchemilla mollis, the garden lady's mantle. Again, I'm not going to go through the facts for you on this slide, but they are the same as I gave earlier on. I know of at least one wildlife trust who now has volunteers going out, removing Alchemilla mollis from their reserves because of its impact on the native flora, but it's a very common and very beautiful plant. There's a question mark on each of these examples because we haven't done enough research yet to measure that invasive potential, but it's one of those species that we have shortlisted for further research. Another example is Japanese anemone. I mean Japanese anemone here in the very broad sense because its taxonomy is a bit of a mess. So your common garden Japanese anemone. This is very interesting because not only has it come up through Plant Alert in Northwest Wales through the project, it was also the most commonly reported plant in my PhD research when I was looking at plants spreading too much in gardens. Despite that, it has no invasive status globally, which I haven't really touched on, but that's often used as a proxy for invasive potential, but it has no invasive status globally and might be a good example of where we need to tease out the differences between a garden weed and an invasive species, but that's a talk in itself. For example is Himalayan honeysuckle. This again has been reported to Plant Alert, as I mentioned earlier, and we are currently doing the species distribution modelling for this species. So hopefully that will yield some interesting results in measuring its potential as an invasive species. And I think this is the last example. I have touched on hard-leaved Houttenia when I was explaining the species distribution modelling. Again, a species that we are looking into further, including by doing the species distribution modelling, and it might be a species that needs a risk assessment. All of those species I've given you as examples of future invaders, very common, popular garden plants. All of them, in fact, very beautiful, and that's no surprise because they've been introduced as ornamentals. Each one is an example of those on the shortlist which need further research. They don't currently have that label of invasive, at least not in legislation, but having that preventative approach, we can avoid having to deal with the consequences of invasive species in future. That's the whole principle behind the approach. I'll end on solutions very quickly. Project, we are also giving gardeners solutions to how they can tackle the issue of invasive species. So we have knowing what you grow as part of the Bee Plant Wise campaign. So Bee Plant Wise is a national campaign led by the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat. So the first step is knowing what you grow. Know whether or not you have an invasive species in the garden. That involves a bit of research, looking at the resources available. I'm leaving leaflets with Northwest Wildlife Trust colleagues for you at the conference. There's information in the leaflets on invasive ornamentals. There's also a guide, which I referenced very quickly earlier on gardening without harmful invasive plants. I've left a few copies for you at the conference, but if you want more copies, please get in touch. All of that is about knowing what you grow and what is invasive and what is not. The second step is to stop the spread of invasive species. That can be as easy as deadheading invasive ornamentals. And the third one is compost with care. Might sound obvious, but not to dump garden waste in the wild. Use your domestic or council composting facilities where appropriate, and of course certain species such as Japanese knotweed are regarded as controlled waste, and those are slightly different. So there are solutions, and those we've been pushing through the project. So invasive species are one of the main threats to nature globally, with an impact on the economy, the human health, and nature generally. Ornamental horticulture is that main source of invasive species globally, but there is a lot that gardeners can do to limit the spread and impact of those invasive species, either by being plant-wise or by registering plants on Plant Alert. And in short, do not stop gardening. As a reminder, the project is very kindly funded by Natural Resources Wales, there's the URL for you there if you want to get involved. Again, there, if you have any questions, please get in touch via the website, or you're welcome to drop me an email. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.